Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're tackling a really complex issue, actually. We're going to be diving into the impact of recent federal employee firings and how this is impacting scientific research in the U.S. And for this one, we've got a thought-provoking Science Journal article, plus we've got some really insightful opinions from researchers who are actually working in the field. So by the time we're done with this one, you'll understand not just what happened, but why this whole thing really matters for the future of science and what it means for you.
Yeah, this isn't just about numbers. We're talking about real people whose lives and work were suddenly disrupted. And yeah, the potential long-term consequences here are huge.
Right, and it all happens so fast. Like literally on February 14th, hundreds of federal employees, many at agencies like the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, they just got these emails saying they were fired, and that was it.
Yeah, no more access to their work projects, just left hanging.
It's crazy. The article really highlights the shock and the confusion that these scientists went through, especially those who were right in the middle of some really important research. There's this one example that really stuck with me. This scientist was reviewing a new medical AI technology on a Saturday night, getting ready for a Monday deadline. And bam, their access is revoked just like that. Totally cut off. Couldn't even communicate with clients.
Oh, wow.
I know. The article does mention that some employees like that scientist were eventually reinstated, but there's still this fear, this uncertainty.
Absolutely. The possibility of more sudden layoffs is out there.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, if most of these firings were focused on probationary employees, why are the experienced researchers so worried?
It's all about the ripple effects you see.
What do you mean?
Even though the firings were targeted at a specific group, the consequences are spreading way beyond that.
I feel like a chain reaction.
Exactly. One area that's been hit hard are the grant management offices at the NIH.
The National Institutes of Health, right?
That's the one.
Yeah.
Those offices are responsible for processing grants and deciding, who gets funding for research projects. But with fewer staff, everything's slowed down.
I see.
And that means researchers like Yuping Wang at Tulane University, they're facing these funding shortages and just a ton of uncertainty about the future of their labs.
So these firings are impacting the whole system that supports scientific research.
Exactly. And that affects all of us in the end. Think about new treatments, new technologies. These things often rely on research that's now facing all these funding roadblocks.
That's a scary thought. And it's not just the funding that's worrying. The article also quotes public health experts like Olivia Zarella. She's an epidemiologist at the University of Colorado, and she's worried about the potential impact on infectious disease surveillance.
Right, that's a key point. Those surveillance systems rely on data from a bunch of different agencies working together, to identify and prevent outbreaks. And losing experts who understand how to collect and analyze all that data, it could really disrupt the flow of information, and that would hinder our ability to respond to public health threats.
So we've got funding delays affecting research and potential weaknesses in our public health infrastructure. Is there anything else we should be paying attention to?
This is where it gets really interesting. Zarella suggests that this situation could shift the balance of research towards the private sector.
How so?
Well, with funding becoming more challenging, some researchers might be more likely to look for funding from private companies instead of government agencies. And while private sector research is valuable, Zarella points out that it can introduce conflicts of interest.
So if the funding source has a stake in the outcome of the research, it could compromise how objective it is.
Exactly. And it raises questions about who controls scientific knowledge and how it's used. Could it lead to important findings being kept private or only accessible to those who can afford it? These are important questions we have to consider.
It's a huge shift in how we think about scientific research, and it leads us to the long-term impact of these firings. It goes beyond the immediate disruption.
Yeah, there's also this potential chilling effect on the whole scientific community.
Like a fear of working in government-funded research.
Exactly. The article mentions several researchers who are worried about the future of research at institutions that have been affected by this. There's this feeling that job security in government science just isn't a given anymore.
I can see why people would be hesitant to dedicate their careers to something that feels so unpredictable.
And the delays in grant funding are creating another problem. Universities are having a hard time making hiring decisions and offering positions to PhD students. The article highlights how this is playing out at Tulane. Wang is finding it harder and harder to attract and retain talented researchers.
So it's this cascade effect. Firings lead to funding delays, which then lead to hiring freezes, and then ultimately impact the pipeline of future scientists.
Yeah, it's a worrying trend for sure. But the article also points to some potential avenues for recourse. There are legal experts and advocacy groups who are pushing back against these firings, arguing that they may not have been done properly.
Okay, that's where things get a bit tricky for those of us who aren't legal experts. The article mentions Suzanne Summerlin. She's an independent labor attorney for the federal sector, and she suggests that the firings might not have followed the guidelines of the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. Can you break that down for our listeners who might not be familiar with this act?
Sure. Basically, the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 outlines procedures for evaluating the performance of federal employees, and it lays out reasons that aren't acceptable for firing someone, like engaging in partisan political activity.
So Summerlin is saying these firings might have violated this act.
She points to a bunch of inconsistencies in how these firings were handled. For example, some employees were fired even though they had received positive performance reviews just before, and others hadn't even been in their positions long enough to be evaluated.
That does raise some red flags. So what options do employees have if they feel they were wrongly terminated?
Well, it depends. If they're members of a labor union, they can contact their representative to see if the union is taking legal action. And for those who aren't unionized, there's the option of filing individual claims with the Merit Systems Protection Board, or joining a class action lawsuit.
So there is a legal path, but it sounds like it could be a long and complicated process.
Unfortunately, that's often how legal battles go.
Yeah.
But there are also efforts to address this issue on a more systemic level.
The article mentions the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology getting involved. What are they doing?
They've started a survey for federal employees who were affected. Their goal is to understand how big this problem really is. And they might use that information to start congressional investigations and hold the agencies accountable.
So it's not just about individual employees fighting for their jobs. There's a chance for change at a policy level.
Exactly. And that's where public engagement becomes crucial. Both Zarella and the researchers we talked about earlier, they emphasize how important it is to raise awareness about the value of these agencies and the research they do.
So what can our listeners do to help?
The most effective thing is to contact their representatives and advocate for scientific research.
It's easy to forget that our elected officials are supposed to represent us.
Right. They do pay attention when they hear from their constituents, especially when a lot of people speak up. So let's all make some noise, spread the word, and remind our representatives that science matters.
It's a good reminder that we have a voice and can actually make a difference.
Yeah.
Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's recap what we've learned.
We've seen how these federal employee firings have created so much uncertainty in the research community. There are some potentially serious long-term consequences for scientific progress and public health. We talked about the legal options for employees and the role Congress might play.
And we've emphasized that this isn't just a problem for scientists. It's something all of us should care about and get involved with.
Now, before we move on, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. How can we balance the need for efficiency in government with the essential role of scientific research in solving the challenges we face?
That's a great question to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive so far. Stay tuned for the next part where we'll continue to explore this important topic.
Yeah, it's a tough question for sure. No easy answers. But we might get some insights by looking at why these firings even happened in the first place. The sources kind of suggest that one of the main drivers was this desire to make government agencies leaner, reduce spending.
So the goal was efficiency.
Seems that way. But as we've seen, trying to streamline things can backfire, especially when it comes to areas as essential as scientific research.
It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet by smashing the whole plumbing system. Sure, you might stop the leak, but now you've got a whole bunch of new problems to deal with.
Perfect analogy. It really highlights the need for a smarter approach, one that recognizes that different government functions are all connected, and that investing in research pays off in the long run.
And speaking of long-term value, we talked about the chilling effect these firings could have on the scientific community. Can you expand on that a little?
Of course. Imagine you're a young scientist just starting out. You're thinking about a career in government research. You've always wanted to use your skills to make a difference. But then you see all these news reports about sudden layoffs and funding being cut and politics messing with science agencies. Would you still be so excited about that path?
Probably not. I'd start to question how stable a government career really is, and whether my work would actually be valued and supported.
That's exactly the concern a lot of researchers are voicing right now. They're worried that these firings send a message that science isn't a priority, that government careers just aren't secure anymore. This could lead to a brain drain as talented scientists decide to go into academia or the private sector where they feel more appreciated.
That would be a huge loss for our government agencies, wouldn't it?
Huge. Those agencies depend on the expertise and the hard work of their scientists, to do essential things like making sure our food and drugs are safe and tracking and responding to public health threats. Losing those experienced researchers could seriously jeopardize their ability to do those critical jobs.
It seems like we're in a tricky spot. We want our government to be efficient and responsible with our money. But cutting funding and staff in essential areas like science can have really serious long-term consequences.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance, and one that requires us to think long-term. We need to get past these short-sighted, cost-cutting measures and recognize that when we invest in science, we're investing in our future.
So how do we encourage that kind of long-term thinking, especially in a political environment that often focuses on immediate results over those long-term investments?
That's the key question, and it brings us back to public engagement. As citizens, we have a responsibility to hold our elected officials accountable. We have to make sure they understand how valuable science is and that it needs our support.
So we need to speak up.
Exactly. Write to your representatives, call their offices, go to town hall meetings, talk to your friends and family. The more we talk about the importance of science, the more likely our officials are to actually listen and do something.
What are some of the main points we should be making in those conversations?
Well, first of all, we need to make it clear that science isn't a partisan issue. It's about using evidence to solve problems and improve people's lives. Whether it's coming up with new medical treatments, protecting our environment, or making sure our food and water are safe. Science is crucial to solving the problems we face as a society.
So connect science to the things that people actually care about in their daily lives.
Exactly. People might not get excited about abstract scientific ideas, but they do care about things like affordable health care, clean air and water, and a safe future for themselves and their kids. We need to make those connections clear and show how investing in science is how we reach those goals.
That makes sense. What else can we do to support science?
We can also get behind organizations that are working to promote science education and research. There are a ton of nonprofits and advocacy groups doing amazing work, and they rely on donations and volunteers.
That's a good way to contribute. Even small donations or a few hours of volunteering can have an impact.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of just staying informed and having thoughtful conversations about science. The more we educate ourselves and each other about the value of science, the more likely we are to build a culture that supports it.
I really like that idea of creating a culture that values science. It shouldn't be seen as something separate from our lives. It's part of who we are and how we understand the world.
I couldn't agree more. Science isn't just about labs and equations. It's about curiosity, creativity, the pursuit of knowledge. It's about asking questions, seeking answers, constantly challenging what we think we know. And those are qualities we should all be striving for no matter what we do or where we come from.
I agree. Well said. Now, before we move on, I want to go back to the legal challenges we were talking about. What's the latest there?
There have been some interesting developments. Remember Suzanne Summerlin, the labor attorney we mentioned?
Yeah, the one who said the firings might have violated the Civil Service Reform Act.
Right. Well, she's been working with some of the employees who were fired, exploring their options. Some have filed complaints with the Merit Systems Protection Board, and others are thinking about joining a class action lawsuit.
What are their chances of winning?
Hard to say for sure. These cases can get pretty complicated. But Summerlin is optimistic. She thinks they have a strong case, especially because of how inconsistent the firings were and the lack of due process a lot of the employees experienced.
That's good to hear. It sounds like these legal challenges could set a precedent for protecting federal employees and making sure future firings are done fairly and legally.
That's what we're hoping for. And these legal battles are also bringing attention to the bigger issue of job security in government science.
Yeah.
And the need for more transparency and accountability in these agencies.
It reminds us that we can't just assume our rights and freedoms will always be there. We have to actively protect them.
Absolutely. And it also shows the courage of these scientists. They're fighting for their jobs and for the integrity of the scientific process.
It's really inspiring. It reminds us that even when things are tough, we can make a difference by standing up for what we believe in.
Well said. And that brings us to another really important point, the role of whistleblowers.
Oh, yeah. We haven't talked much about that. Can you tell us more?
Of course. A whistleblower is someone who exposes wrongdoing inside an organization, often putting themselves in risk. In this situation with the firings, whistleblowers could be really important. They could uncover any violations of the law or ethical breaches that might have happened.
So they're like the watchdogs, making sure everything's running fairly and openly.
Exactly, and they're especially important in government, where there's always the risk of someone abusing their power or corruption.
But whistleblowing can be dangerous, right?
It definitely can be.
Yeah.
Whistleblowers often face retaliation from their employers, things like demotions, harassment, even getting fired. They can also be sued or smeared in the media.
Wow, that's a lot to go through. Why would anyone do that?
It comes down to conscience, to believing in truth and accountability. Whistleblowers feel a moral obligation to expose wrongdoing, even if it means risking their careers and reputations. They see it as a matter of principle and a way to protect the public.
It takes a lot of guts.
It does. And it's important to remember that whistleblowers are often the first line of defense against corruption and abuse of power. They're crucial to making sure our institutions are held accountable and that the public can trust them.
So how can we support whistleblowers?
There are several things we can do. First, we can create a culture that values transparency and accountability, encouraging people to speak up if they see something wrong, and protecting whistleblowers from retaliation.
So an environment where people feel safe speaking out.
Exactly. We also need to support laws that protect whistleblowers and give them legal options if they're retaliated against.
Makes sense. Are there any organizations that are working to protect whistleblowers?
Yeah, there are several nonprofits and advocacy groups that offer legal aid and support to whistleblowers. One example is the Government Accountability Project. They've been fighting for whistleblower rights for over 40 years.
Good to know. I'm sure our listeners will want to check them out.
I think so. And it's important to remember that supporting whistleblowers isn't just about protecting individuals. It's about safeguarding our democracy and making sure our institutions operate with integrity and honesty.
It's a reminder that we all have a part to play in making sure things are done ethically.
Exactly. And it brings us back to the core of our discussion today, the importance of informed and engaged citizens, whether it's standing up for science supporting whistleblowers or just being aware of what's going on in our communities. We all have a responsibility to participate in our democracy and make our voices heard.
I love that idea of being an informed and engaged citizen. It's about recognizing that we're not just passive bystanders. We have the power to shape the world around us.
Precisely. And that's a powerful thing to remember.
Well said. I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive. But stick with us, folks. We'll be back soon for the final part of our exploration. We'll dig into some potential solutions and offer some concrete actions you can take to make a real difference. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive. It's been a lot taking in all the information about the impact of these federal employee firings. We've seen some pretty concerning trends, and the potential long-term consequences are kind of scary.
They are, yeah. But it's important to remember that we're not just dwelling on the negative here. The point is to understand what's going on so we can figure out how to move forward.
Right, knowledge is power. So let's talk about solutions. What can we do to fix these problems? What can we as individuals and as a society do to help scientific research and protect its integrity?
That's the million-dollar question, and I think there are a few things we can try. One idea that's been getting some attention is this concept of scientific citizenship.
Scientific citizenship.
Yeah. It's the idea that we all have a responsibility to support and promote science, even if we aren't scientists ourselves.
So it's about recognizing that science isn't just something that happens in labs, it's something that affects all of us.
Exactly. Scientific citizenship is about engaging with science in our everyday lives, staying informed about scientific issues, and fighting for policies that support science research and education.
That sounds like a good way to connect scientists and the public.
It is. And there are a lot of ways to practice scientific citizenship. You can support organizations that promote science literacy. You can go to science festivals or lectures. You can volunteer at a science museum. Or just talk about science with your friends and family.
Those are all great ideas. I think sometimes people are intimidated by science, like it's only for people with PhDs.
I get that. But science is everywhere. It's in the food we eat, the air we breathe, the technology we use, and everyone can learn about science and appreciate it.
That's a good point. So fostering a sense of curiosity about the world is a good place to start.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Scientists love to share their knowledge and their passion.
And speaking of scientists, one of the big takeaways from this whole conversation has been how important it is to support them. What can we do about the things they're struggling with, like job insecurity and funding cuts?
Well, there are a few things. One is to increase funding for science research. That would give scientists more resources to do their work, and it would create more jobs and stability.
That makes sense. But getting more funding can be tough, especially when science isn't seen as a priority.
It can be. That's why it's so important for people to speak up. We need to tell our elected officials that we care about science and that we want them to invest in it.
So write to our representatives, go to town halls, have those conversations you mentioned.
Yes, exactly. And it's not just about money. It's also about creating a better environment for scientists to work in. That means things like better job security, less paperwork, and a culture of collaboration and respect.
Those are all important. I think we forget sometimes that scientists are people, too.
They are. And they deserve to work in a place that values them and supports them.
Definitely. So besides advocating for better working conditions for scientists, what else can we do to help science?
Scientific integrity is really important. We need to make sure that research is done ethically and transparently.
That's how we keep the public's trust in science.
Exactly. And there are ways to do that. We can strengthen peer review, make sure data is shared and reproducible, and deal with conflicts of interest.
Those are all good steps, and it goes back to that idea of scientific citizenship. We all have a responsibility to be critical of the information we see and to hold scientists accountable.
I agree. And it's not about not trusting science. It's about understanding that science is done by people. And people make mistakes and have biases.
That's true. So we need to be careful about what we read and make sure we're getting information from reliable sources.
Absolutely. And if you see something that doesn't seem right, don't be afraid to ask about it.
It's a good reminder that we all have a responsibility to protect science.
Well, we do. And if we work together, we can make sure science is both rigorous and trustworthy.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have a much better grasp of the issues facing scientific research and what we can do about them.
I'm glad to hear that. I hope our listeners feel like they can do something too.
Me too. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the main things you want listeners to take away from this?
Well, I hope they've come to appreciate the importance of science. Science isn't just a bunch of facts. It's a way of thinking. It's how we understand the world.
It's about being curious, exploring things, and always wanting to learn more.
Exactly. And it's something we should all support and celebrate.
For sure. What else?
I also hope our listeners understand the problems that science is facing right now. Those problems are real and they're serious, but we can solve them.
We've talked about some solutions like increasing funding and making sure science is done ethically.
Right. And we can all do something to help.
Whether it's speaking up, educating ourselves, or just talking about science.
Exactly. Every little bit helps.
That's inspiring. So to our listeners out there, stay curious, stay involved, and stay hopeful.
The future of science and the future of our world depends on it.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned a lot.
It's been great being here.
And until next time, keep exploring and keep learning.